In Magic, typically, casting something for free is really strong. So strong that a card doesn't even need to do that much to be worthwhile. However, there are some cards in Magic that cost 0 mana, and they just aren't worth it. While paying 0 is great, you do generally want a card to be able to do something, otherwise you're just giving yourself card disadvantage. In this video, I'm going to give you my picks for the 10 worst 0 mana cards in Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. While the order of this list and the cards that appear in it is ultimately left up to my opinion, there are some characteristics a card has to have to even be considered for this list. In particular, the card has to be bad in all 3 of Magic's main play modes, that is 40 card formats, 60 card formats, and Commander. It also has to have been bad for all of its history. In other words, the card has to have always been bad, and it has to be bad everywhere. It's challenging to call a card one of the worst ones ever if those things aren't true. Alright, let's dive into the list. At number 10, I've got the 3 0 mana kobolds from Legends, all of which are 0 mana, 0/1 creatures. Sorry kobold fans, these cards are awful. Sure, they're free, but 0/1s are almost entirely irrelevant creatures. They can't attack or block well, the best they're going to do is chump block, and all of that means you end up with significant card disadvantage when you play kobolds of Care, Keep, and Friends. When they designed these cards, the idea was that you'd get them in play and then buff them with cards like Kobold Drill Sergeant or Roga, but they just didn't print enough kobold payoffs for that to ever be worth it. Over the years, this has improved some. There's a much better new version of Roga, for example, but the meager support for kobolds over the years has still resulted in these cards being awful. Slamming a kobold on the battlefield on turn 1 feels more like you're mulliganing than doing anything else. It is possible that someday they won't be terrible. With some new support for kobolds, these cards would get a lot better, but for now, they're some of the worst 0 mana cards in Magic. But as bad as they are far better than anything else on this list. At number 9, I've got Herbal Poultice. This 0 mana artifact comes with an activated ability. You can pay 3 and sacrifice it to regenerate a creature. In other words, it's free to cast, but it doesn't do anything until you get to 3 mana, and the thing it does when you get to 3 mana isn't that impressive for the cost. Sure, it can save a creature should you have 3 mana lying around, but the best you're going to do in those situations is trade 1 for 1, and in the meantime you have a card that doesn't do anything. It's funny to compare the Poultice to Welding Jar, which is actually an older card, and it's a 0 mana artifact that has done some serious work in multiple formats, and while it can only regenerate artifacts, it doesn't cost any mana to do it. Now, it's true that the floor on 0 mana artifacts is a little higher than you'd expect, since they can fuel things like Affinity, but the problem with cards like Herbal Poultice, and the other 0 mana artifacts that are on this list, is that they are downright awful if you don't have them at the right time. There are enough cheap and free artifacts with better effects out there, like the aforementioned Welding Jar, that there is no reason to ever run these, even in a deck that's all about 0 mana artifacts. At number 8, I've got Dark Sphere. This 0 mana artifact has an activated ability that doesn't cost any mana at all. Of course, it's also a super underpowered and narrow effect. You can sacrifice it to prevent half the damage done to you by a single source rounded down. That can be nice in the very specific situation where someone points a fireball at you, but it's pretty useless apart from that and certainly not worth a card. It's basically a really, really bad fog. At number 7, I've got Delif's Cone. This is another free artifact with a free effect, but this one is even more narrow than Dark Sphere is most of the time. You can tap it and sacrifice it, and when target creature you control attacks and isn't blocked, you can gain life equal to its power. If you do, it assigns no combat damage this turn. In other words, it doesn't do anything unless you have an unblocked creature. That's already kind of a big ask, and the effect it gives you is meager at best. It gives that creature the worst version of lifelink ever, since you only get the you gain life part. One of the great things about lifelink is how it can really shift a race in your favor, since if your lifelink creature hits your opponent, the life difference between you and them is double whatever that creature's power was. That's not the case here, since you blank the combat damage and just gain life. At number 6, I've got a land, Oasis. That's right, lands have a mana value of 0/2. However, I did restrict the lands that could be on this list to the ones that don't produce mana, since any land that produces mana is way better than everything else on this list, even if it enters tapped and can only produce colorless. In the early days of Magic, they designed a lot of manaless lands like Oasis. Obviously, if a land can't produce mana, which is, what they're for, it really needs to do something powerful, like Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, since using up your land drop for a turn on something that doesn't actually increase your mana is a really big cost, and Oasis definitely doesn't get there with such a weak ability. All it can do is tap to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. Preventing 1 damage can sometimes make combat go badly for your opponent, but it also doesn't do anything a huge chunk of the time, so using up a card and a land drop on this is a good way to go down a card without actually getting anything. At number 5, it's another land, Rhystic Cave. This one can kind of produce mana, but it basically never does. This is because when you tap it for mana, any player can pay 1 generic to keep you from actually getting that mana. Allowing your opponents to blank your mana for only 1 mana of their own is a really, really bad idea, especially in multiplayer games where someone is virtually guaranteed to have 1 generic mana to pay to stop your land from doing anything. At number 4, I've got the Legends Banding lands. This is a cycle of lands that don't produce mana. Each of these grant legendary creatures of a particular color the ability to band with other legends. Banding is upside. It's famously complex, but the short version of it is this. Your creatures can attack and block as a group, and you get to decide how combat damage gets divided in combat. The problem with this cycle, though, is that it's an inherently worse version of banding. Most cards with banding can band with any other creature, but this cycle not only restricts the ability to band to only legendary creatures, it also only lets them band with other legendary creatures. This super powered down version of banding is largely insignificant as a result, so you definitely don't want to be spending a land drop or a card on any of them. At number 3, I've got Gustha's Scepter. For 0 mana, this is an artifact with 2 abilities. You can tap it and exile a card from your hand face down, and you can look at it as long as it remains face down, and you can also tap it to return a card you own exiled with the scepter to your hand. If it ended there, it'd be a weird card for sure, but it would at least have some uses, like protecting cards from disruption. It would still be bad, since it takes you a full turn to exile the card and another turn to get it back, but the last part of the card is what makes it really brutal. When you lose control of the scepter, you put all the cards exiled with it into their owner's graveyard. So maybe you can try to protect your hand from a discard effect, but you open yourself up to losing that card anyway because this artifact punishes you so hard when it gets destroyed, or you otherwise lose control of it. At number 2, I've got Evermind. This is a 0 mana card that can't do anything on its own. It doesn't have a 0 cost that you can actually pay for, it has no mana cost at all, so you can't cast it normally. The idea behind the design is that you can splice it onto arcane spells. Kamigawa Block does have lots of arcane spells, and if you're casting one, you can pay 1 generic and a blue to splice this onto it, which means it gains the card's text. In other words, you get to pay 2 extra mana to draw a card when you cast arcane spells. When you splice, you do get to hold on to Evermind, and that means you can theoretically keep on splicing if you have more arcane spells. But the fact that this does nothing outside of a deck without arcane spells is a massive liability. They really should have made it cost 5 or something to draw you a card in order to keep it from being this terrible, because the floor on it is awful with the current design. And even when you do have it in the perfect deck, things aren't going to line up for you to splice it very often. First, you have to cast an arcane spell, second, you need Evermind in your hand, and third, you need a spare 2 mana lying around in order to splice it. That's a whole bunch of hoops you have to jump through, and it just isn't worth the effort, especially because most of the arcane spells in existence aren't very good. We need to see a lot more arcane spells and maybe some arcane spell payoffs in our future for Evermind to ever end up being good enough. And at number 1, I've got Sorrow's Path. This land, of course, doesn't produce mana, and then it has an incredibly narrow and convoluted effect. You can tap it and choose 2 target blocking creatures an opponent controls. If each of those creatures could block all the creatures that the other is blocking, remove both of them from combat. Each one then blocks all creatures the other was blocking. So to sum up, if your opponent blocks with 2 or more creatures, you can force 2 of them to switch how they are blocking. That's way too narrow. If your opponent only blocks with one thing, the ability is unusable, and if they do block with 2 or more creatures, you have to hope things line up in such a way that you actually get something out of switching the block around, and that's very, very far from guaranteed. So already this card would probably be on the list because its effect is so weak and often unusable, but it gets even worse. When Sorrow's Path gets tapped, it does 2 damage to each of your creatures. So when you do this whole block switching thing, your whole board gets damaged, which makes it even less likely that switching blocks around will matter, since some of your creatures probably outright died, and others have been damaged so that they are more likely to die in combat, even with a switched block. People often try to defend Sorrow's Path by bringing up the Enrage mechanic, And it's true, if you have payoffs for having your creatures get damaged, this gets better, but it's still really bad. This is because you can't even tap the path for its ability, except when your opponent blocks with 2 or more creatures, and in the meantime you have a land that does absolutely nothing, and even in an enraged deck, more often than not, using this ability and tapping it are going to be more downside than upside. So yeah, Sorrow's Path is not only the worst 0 mana card of all time, it's also the worst land of all time. So those are my picks for the 10 worst 0 mana cards in Magic. These cards might be free, but they aren't worth it. If you'd like to own any of these cards, which are only free when it comes to mana, there are links in the description that will take you to the Card Kingdom store page for each of these cards. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see more MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards ever printed, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.